All right, let's try and make sense of this story. What is the evolving situation in what is already a very volatile Middle East? Joining us now is Mr. Gershom Gorenberg. He's a senior Israeli journalist and historian and writer. Thank you very much, Mr. Gorenberg, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Let's start with this war, which has suddenly now flared up in southern Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon. It started off, I think, about a month or so back with Israel saying it wants to resettle about 60,000 of its citizens back in the northern areas. And then, of course, the pager attacks, and then we had the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Now it's pretty much a full-blown war between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Do you see this? How do you see this playing itself out? Because Israel, when it went in, it first said it was a limited ground operation. Do you see this being limited, or do you see this dragging out?
Well, let's, first of all, a bit of context. This was the expansion of what was essentially a war of attrition which had been going on since October of 2023. Immediately after the Hamas attack on Israel last October, Hezbollah began firing missiles, drones, and so forth into northern Israel, and has been doing so ever since. And that continued fire forced the evacuation of tens of thousands of Israelis from their homes in communities along the northern border. So there had been this low level, but quite serious fighting going on all that time. And the question was always, how should Israel deal with that? Now, one possibility of dealing with that was to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. Hezbollah claimed that they would stop shooting if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. We don't know whether they would have kept their word on that, but that possibility was never tested. In mid-September, beginning with the so-called pager attack, the conflict escalated into a full-blown front of the war. First with the attack on Hezbollah operatives via the exploding pagers and walkie-talkies, then attacks on Hezbollah weapons stores, and then the assassination of Nasrallah, and then the ground invasion. The one thing I can say from experience, from history, is that limiting a conflict inside of Lebanon has eluded Israel twice in the past. And in general, one of the principles of war, if you go back to Karl von Clausewitz's On War, the master text of modern war, is that wars don't go the way that you plan them to. Mm-hmm. The other side doesn't necessarily react the way that you expected. Conditions are not necessarily what you expected. So I allow myself to have some doubts as to the extent to which the Israeli government can control how far this will go. In other words, the original planning may have been for a very limited campaign, but that's not purely. War is chaos. War is unplannedness. And so it would be very, very dangerous to make a prediction of how limited this will actually be.
I do want to ask you, going back to when the war in Gaza began, the objective was to sort of reduce Hamas to a position where it can never again, or at least for the foreseeable future, launch another October 7th style attack. And multiple Israeli officials, including the Israeli ambassador here in India, who was here in our studios last week, he said he believes that Hamas today militarily is so reduced that it cannot launch another October 7th style attack. And the only objective now of the Israeli forces there is to try and get some of the hostages back. The close to 100 hostages are still in Hamas captivity. Why then are we not seeing Israel move in that direction? Why doesn't Israel say, okay, our military operations in Gaza are over, we are ready to find a ceasefire, and let's get the hostages out?
I would say to you that that's a question that a majority of the Israeli population is asking. And it is at the center of Israeli politics today. First, let's go back to the point that you started with. What was the objective at the start of the fighting last October? Hamas attacked Israel. There's a tendency to speak of that attack as being a single-day attack, but that's an incorrect impression. because the Hamas rocket and missile attacks on Israel continued intensively after October 7th and to some extent to this day. So one of the original objectives was to simply stop the attack on Israel. Much of the early bombing campaign, for instance, was aimed at the sites from which Hamas was firing missiles into Israel. Israeli cities were under constant bombardment. Israelis were constantly running to bomb shelters. That hasn't stopped. It's the intensity has dropped, but that hasn't stopped. There was the second goal stated of making sure that Hamas could never launch such an attack. Fascinatingly and dangerously, there was never a political outcome stated. That is to say, the Israeli government has never formulated what it sees who it sees governing Gaza and how at the end of the campaign. And that has left a vacuum of governance in the Gaza Strip, which, according to most sources, has created a situation in which, in some areas, there's no government whatsoever. It's a complete failed state situation, or as somebody phrased it recently, it's the Somaliaization of Gaza. And in other areas, Hamas is still in control. So that's a strategic vacuum in the planning of the Israeli government. That still leaves your question. All summer, there were intensive ceasefire attacks, which held out the possibility of a return of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. And why Prime Minister Netanyahu and other key figures in his government did not leap at that opportunity is a subject of constant debate in Israel. One of the explanations commonly given in Israeli debate is that Netanyahu fears the end of the war in terms of his own political situation. Because when the fighting ends, the internal pressure for a state commission of inquiry into how the government let this catastrophe happen, how the war was handled, the pressure for that is going to increase drastically. And the pressure for new elections is going to increase drastically. So the reasons may have to do more with Israeli internal politics than anything else.
And I want to get
that hypothesis. We don't know what's going on in his mind.
I want to get a final word, and this is what the world is most concerned about right now, especially after the ballistic missile attacks by Iran into Israel a few days ago. Again, I go back to what the ambassador told me last week, that it's a question of when and not if, that Israel will retaliate. It'll be seen to be retaliating. The worry, and without getting into what form or shape that retaliation will take, the worry is, how does one prevent that from then becoming this escalatory cycle? That how does Israel seemingly retaliate against Iran for what it did last Tuesday, and yet at the same time, the response from Iran need not be that it inevitably goes up the escalation chain?
That is another question which is very, very serious, and I don't think there's a simple answer to it. One potential answer to it is something on the level of what happened after Iran's April attack, which was an attack on one specific Iranian base, showing Israel's ability to do so, but leaving the Iranians with the option of saying, okay, we hit you, you hit us, we'll stop here. And the government could choose such a path, and I would guess that there is strong pressure from the Biden administration in the United States to take such a path. On the other hand, there are very vocal voices within Israel, not just within the government, but even within opposition parties, for a stronger response, which is meant to be a deterrent, to say to the Iranians, don't hit us again, but could have, as you've just said, the opposite effect. And could have wider effects. For instance, hitting the Iranian oil facilities, as has been proposed, besides its effect on the world oil markets, could lead to the Iranians trying to hit civilian facilities in Israel, which could lead to much higher loss of civilian life and to a much greater escalation. So the dilemma that the Israeli government faces right now is how to respond to this attack without essentially fulfilling one of Hamas's strategic goals from the beginning of the war, which is setting off a regional conflict.
Okay.
I wish I could say that the Israeli government is sufficiently careful about that, but I'm not at all certain of that.
All right, Mr. Gershom Gorenberg, thank you very much for joining us and putting those thoughts into perspective for our viewers. Thank you.